My name is Frank Bramlett, and I'm currently serving as the Program Director for the International Comic Arts Forum. It is my pleasure to host this evening's event. Originally, the Icaf 2020 conference was to be held concurrently with the Small Press Expo in September 2020. Because of COVID-19, our conference was canceled, so we have reimagined a way for accepted Icaf panelists to make their contribution to Icaf and have organized a series of online events to achieve Icaf's mission of celebrating comics through scholarship. Today's virtual session is entitled Graphic Activism: The Extraordinary, the Ordinary, and the Precarious. It's been my pleasure to co-organize this roundtable event series with Icaf Treasurer Biz Neidham, and we would like to express our gratitude to the other members of Icaf's Executive Committee for their support. And a special thanks to Emily Decker for managing the technical aspects of the Zoom webinar. Before we begin our roundtable session, a note on the technical side of this Zoom webinar event. First of all, this event is being recorded and will be posted online on the Icaf website after its conclusion. We are also leaving the chat function on so that members of the webinar are able to discuss the presentations or communicate with me regarding issues. However, I will be moderating the chat, and I will ask that all conversation be thoughtful and respectful, as well as mindful of how excessive chatting can be distracting for all participants in today's webinar. Soon after the panelists have given a short summary of their research, we will open the floor for questions. Please submit all questions via the Q&A function, which you will find at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible within the time available to us, though we apologize in advance if we are not able to address all inquiries. We are grateful that we can provide free access to our conference events this year, but if you're able, we would welcome your donations through our PayPal account to help support the costs of hosting our online programming. You can find the button to donate at the bottom of the Icaf homepage, which is located at www.internationalcomicartsforum.org. Thank you again to everyone for helping make tonight's event happen. For tonight's event, Brittany Tullis has agreed to moderate the roundtable discussion. Brittany Tullis is Associate Professor of Spanish and Women and Gender Studies at St. Ambrose University. Her published work on trans-American comics and cultural studies appears in Hispanic Issues Online, the International Journal of Comic Art, and Comic Studies Here and Now. She is co-editor and contributing author of the 2018 Eisner Award nominee, Picturing Childhood, Youth in Transnational Comics, with Mark Heimerman, as well as a coordinator of a special 2020 issue of Mitologías Hoy on Latinx American comics with Ana Marino and Tania Perez-Cano. Brittany currently serves as Academic Director of the International Comic Arts Forum and as First Vice President of the Comic Studies Society. So I would ask Brittany to turn on her screen and take over the function of moderator for tonight's panel. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm really excited about this roundtable. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists for tonight. And since we have sort of a short time and I would like the emphasis to be on the presentations and the questions and answers, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce you to our panelists for tonight. So we're going to start with Brianna Anderson, who will be giving a talk titled A Gentle Fantasy of Ocean Conservation, Environmental Justice in Aquacorn Cove. Brianna Anderson is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Florida. She is currently working on a dissertation examining representations of environmental disaster in comics for children and young adults. Her work has been published in Studies in Comics and is forthcoming in The Lion and the Unicorn, a special issue on children's literature and climate change that'll be published in 2021. Next, we have Keith Friedlander, who will be giving a talk titled The Role of Communal Studios in Combating Precarious Labor. Dr. Keith Friedlander is a communications instructor at Olds College in Alberta, Canada. He is the current president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics. His research focuses on production cultures in the modern comic book industry, as well as representations of sexuality and gender in superhero comics. His work is published in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics and the Middle Spaces, as well as the upcoming anthology Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. Finally, Ben Macklin will be giving a presentation titled Celebrating the Ordinary in Chris Ware's Rusty Brown. Ben Macklin is a PhD student in English at Northeastern University, focusing on comics and contemporary literature. His primary research interests are in media studies, theories of reading, and histories of print. Ben received a BA in English with honors from Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He recently published his first comic book entitled How to Draw Bad, a collection of comics. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over now to Brianna, who will be giving the first presentation. I will introduce each speaker as it is their turn to present, and we'll save all the questions for the end, please.
All right, Brittany, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Icaf for hosting our panel tonight. Let me hop over onto screen share. All right. As the recent devastating snowstorms in Texas have vividly demonstrated, we are in the middle of a global climate crisis that disproportionately impacts poor and marginalized communities. As this crisis continues to escalate, environmental disasters and extreme weather will almost certainly impact the lives of many of today's children and young adults who will need to adapt to an increasingly inhospitable world ravaged by environmental crisis. Given this unsettling reality, Carly Trott contends that empowering today's children to understand and take action on climate change should be an important goal, both to A, support children's agency so they can help tackle this problem, and B, also to help promote present and future community resilience in the face of these often very devastating climate change impacts. In my presentation, I examine how Katie O'Neill's middle grade graphic novel, Aquacorn Cove, takes up this challenge by using a gentle fantasy narrative to educate children about climate change and ocean conservation. Published in 2018, the comic centers on young protagonist Lana as she returns home to help her nameless coastal village rebuild after a devastating storm. There, she rescues an injured baby aquacorn, a seahorse-unicorn hybrid creature that lives in a coral reef off the coast of the village. As Lana helps the village and the baby aquacorn recover, she discovers that her village's unsustainable fishing practices have damaged the reef and endangered local marine animal populations. So, building up this narrative, the graphic novel seeks to educate children about ocean preservation and inspire youth eco-activism in several significant ways, two of which I'll briefly touch on here. So, most obviously, what O'Neill is doing with this very strange, in a lot of ways, graphic novel is that she is drawing from dominant tropes in children's literature by using these cute, whimsical fantasy creatures to evoke sympathy for marine life. She depicts Lana's rescued baby aquacorn as a tiny, fragile creature. Similarly, the comic portrays the wild adult aquacorns as brightly colored, playful, and distinctly feminine creatures. By contrast, real marine life, such as fish, appear only occasionally in the background of the panels, functioning mostly as decorative set pieces. So on the one hand, by focusing on the fantastical aquacorns, O'Neill's gentle fantasy comic can help teach children about the need for ocean conservation without invoking overwhelming feelings of eco-anxiety or paralysis. After all, effective environmental children's literature should probably make kids feel excited or at least motivated to help nature, not terrorize them or make them want to give up. On the other hand, by prioritizing the aquacorns over the real marine creatures actually threatened by the environmental issues portrayed in the comic, O'Neill implies that children first need to feel sympathy for cute fantasy animals before they can extend or translate that concern to real animals and plants threatened by actual environmental disaster. This reliance on the gentle fantasy facade underestimates children's capacity to grapple with frightening environmental issues, and it mystifies the grim realities and devastating scale of issues like ocean acidification, overfishing, and warming seawater. Second, the comic does convey an environmental message by highlighting the link between environmental destruction and social inequalities. Lana's Aunt May justifies the village's harmful exploitation of the ocean by highlighting the economic necessities motivating their overfishing. She insists we have to bring money to the village or it won't survive. And moreover, she also draws attention to the apparent powerlessness of small groups of people to enact meaningful environmental change, saying, my village is just a speck in the ocean. You're asking us to sacrifice our whole livelihoods for what? Barely making a difference. So rather than simply vilifying the humans for destroying the reef, the comic emphasizes the tension between economic survival and environmental stewardship, a topic often conspicuously absent from children's literature. Significantly, the villagers do eventually see the errors of their ways and resolve to return to the traditional small-scale fishing practices used by their great-grandmothers, not their male ancestors. Additionally, May resolves to find alternative, more sustainable ways to generate income, saying, it's time to see what our village can grow and provide for itself, and we can find other things to sell, things the aquacorns make. By working together with the ocean creatures to generate income, the village plans to reduce its negative impact on the reef and return to balance of the sea. Of course, Aunt May's suggestion that friendly marine creatures will help to financially support the humans by producing goods and finding things for them to sell is clearly a utopic fantasy that still operates within capitalist logics, rather than envisioning less inherently destructive economic systems altogether. However, the comic's conclusion does effectively model an environmental justice poetics by promoting both environmental well-being and social justice for the humans. In other words, by portraying the villagers compassionately working with nature to develop mutually beneficial solutions, and by not magically erasing the very real financial pressures that shape how humans interact with the environment, Aquacorn Cove does encourage children to imagine more environmentally friendly, just futures. And there is more that I can say, but I will end there so we can move on to our next presentations, and I am happy to take questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Brianna. Dr. Friedlander, would you like to go ahead and take over with your presentation now?
Certainly. Thanks very much, Brittany, for the introduction, and thank you to Icaf for inviting us, and to Frank and Biz for organizing all of these online sessions. It's been really great preparing for it, and I'm glad to have the chance to share my research. So my work into investigating artist-led studio spaces really kind of comes out of research that I started doing 5 years ago into the conditions in which comics are made and production cultures. I was interested in studying editorial process and the work that is done by editors and the work that is done in the background, which is what some of my early publications were about. And that led me to reading comic studies scholars like Casey Brianza and Bart Beatty, and scholars who encourage examining comics through a sociological lens. Casey Brianza kind of defines a sociological approach to comics as the object of study is understanding comics as a product of the social and organizational circumstances that produce them. So that if you're going to understand comics as a work of art or as a work of culture, you have to study the conditions and the culture around them that helps to create them. Also the idea of, and this leads me to, studying studios as a way of understanding how do comic artists work together, how do the social conditions that they work within shape their work, and artist-led studios spaces seemed like a useful way to do that, because it's kind of like a contained ecosystem or social system of artists kind of existing together. I also kind of draw on the idea of that Benjamin Wu has talked about in terms of scene thinking, that examining culture as a scene that exists with a kind of cultural social order to it. So that's what led me to studying these creator-run studios. I began doing interviews in 2019. I did interviews with a few creators, a handful of creators at 3 different studios, Helioscope, which is in Portland, Raid, which is in Toronto, and World Monster HQ, which is in Minneapolis. And it really began as an attempt to kind of understand the conditions that they're working in and just kind of understand, well, what happens at these studios, how are they run, how are they organized. And I was really trying to take that sociological approach of studying the comics. Like what I was interested in is, well, how does this space influence your work? Or how does collaboration on a comic in a studio space vary versus collaboration in, you know, an online space, or artists who are apart, or artists who are working in their own homes? So I was trying to approach it through a lens of how can I better understand the comics these people create. And what I found was that what was much more interesting to me was not how do these environments influence their work, but how do these environments influence the people within them, and how do they influence the industry? And what I really ended up focusing on, or what the interviews kind of led me to examine, because that was the richest area of information, was how do people enter into, move through, and survive an industry like the comics industry. So I'm gonna share a tweet, because that's the level of prep that I did, is having a tweet. But this was a tweet that went up from Domino Books, which is like a small press indie publisher of comics, that they just kind of tweeted this out back in December, which I thought this little tweet does a lot to explain what I love about comics and what I find fascinating about them, which is just that comics is the art form of people who fall through the cracks, which I think has a lot of truth to it. One thing that fascinates me about comics is that they have a niche experimental DIY element to them, and that lends them a kind of experimental edge, that even comics being produced from, you know, major labels and the big two, there's a potential and an ability for artists to experiment in comics that you don't have with major motion pictures, and you don't have with more expensive, cost-heavy productions like video games or things like that. And I think that's what I've always loved and what's always drawn me to comics. But I think studying studios has led me to understand that this leads to a lack of infrastructure, this leads to a lack of support, and that when you look at the history of comics, as I said in my video lecture, comics have always kind of been ahead of the curve in terms of existing within precarious working conditions. And I think what I found in these studios were people who were creating an infrastructure in an industry that provides very little infrastructure to its workers and to its creative. And that what I love about comics is how, you know, loose the controls are and how free reign it can be, is also part of what makes it difficult work for people and what leads to burnout. And so that's kind of where my research went. I think my last thing I'll say is that my only real regret with this research project is that I really haven't been able to develop it much since 2019, partially because the switch to online teaching has kind of exhausted a lot of my time. I really would like to do more primary research and more interviews and more surveys with these artists. I'm really curious to find out specifically how has COVID impacted these people who had a shared workspace. But unfortunately, I really haven't had time to do any follow-up research, and I hope to this summer. So that's kind of where I am in this project at the moment. But yeah, that's all I'll say for now. And thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you so much. Definitely hearing that on the online teaching fatigue. So, all right, we're going to go ahead then and hand it over to Ben Macklin, who will be giving the final synopsis of his talk today.
Thank you very much, Brittany, for the introduction. Thank you to Frank, Emily, and Biz for all the preparation that was involved in making this event happen. I'm so excited to be able to participate, even in this virtual format. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and show a short, modest presentation of the very modest research that I had put together recently. So the title of my topic is Celebrating the Ordinary in Chris Ware's Rusty Brown, which might be quite deflating after two very extraordinary presentations on extraordinary topics. But this research was interesting to me during my first year in graduate school, where I was lucky enough to be confronted by this book by Toril Moy entitled Revolution of the Ordinary. And I was reading this book at the same time that I encountered this gigantic hunk of paper known as Rusty Brown by Chris Ware. And I found that both of them seemed to be touching on very relevant, contemporary, and interesting themes that I hadn't really thought about in a long time. So I'm going to share some of my findings now. If my screen would move. There we go. So something that many of us might be familiar with in comics scholarship is an attention to the formal conventions of comics, what we expect to see, how we interpret the movement from one panel to another. That seems to be a very dominant area of research and publication when it comes to analyzing comics. So the example we have on the left here is Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which is a staple of comic scholarship that many of us might be familiar with. And on the right here, we have an excerpt from Neil Cohn's work in 2019, which talks about a visual language to comics and how we can understand the syntax of how pages are designed. But one thing that always has felt missing to me, or at least began to feel missing to me after reading Toril Moy's work, was the sort of foregoing of story that we do when we look so closely at the formal aspects of comics. And so that's what drew me to this concept known as ordinary language philosophy, which is often considered to be spearheaded by a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Toril Moy's book, Revolution of the Ordinary, is an analysis of Wittgenstein's theory, as well as Stanley Cavell and others. And one of the sort of examples of ordinary language philosophy that's given here is this idea that to learn the language of bullfighting, which has its own Spanish dialect that is associated with just the action of the bullfight, is to learn to see the bullfight, just as learning the language of sewing is to learn to see stitches and seams. So the way that we acquire language and the way we learn to understand our environment is connected to experiences we have in those environments. It's not enough to be told something, we must experience it firsthand. And ordinary language philosophy holds that disagreements philosophically are rooted in linguistic disagreements. So solutions are found in concrete language and clear communication while avoiding abstract language as much as possible. So in the example of a comic, this would mean temporarily disregarding the form that the stories are conveyed in, the shape of the book, all the images, all of this exciting stuff, and focusing only on the stories and the life experiences that are buried in words. So I'm going to give an example of that here, where I disregard temporarily the beautiful form of this book and focus only on the stories that it conveys. And as Chris Ware's little character here tells us, don't worry, capture the gesture, not the form, at least for right now. So one example of this in practice in Rusty Brown is that Alice and her brother Chalky are now moving to a city called Omaha, and they ask their grandmother where the name comes from. She explains that it's one of the several tribes that were native to the region, including the Sioux and the Potawatomi, or Potawatomi, depending on your pronunciation. Chalky struggles with the word, quite obviously, as I had many times myself, and asks for help. But he's not given any context in order to understand what the tribe is, and it's ultimately not being put into practice, so the words evaporate from his language. And eventually, the memory of the tribe itself will evaporate too if it's not being ingrained in people's minds through experience. When Chalky arrives at his new school, a teacher writes the word hospitality on the board and encourages the students to embrace that philosophy and show hospitality to Chalky. But because the students haven't actually engaged in the experience of being hospitable, they can't do so for Chalky here. And he very uncomfortably stands in front of the room in silence and has to introduce himself. He does not receive hospitality because the people just don't know the experience described by the word. As Toril Moy explains, to learn what to call a thing, whether that word be father or love or anything else, is to learn what it is. So to associate a certain action is to understand what that word means, or at least for one person. In this example in the book, a small child named Jordan Lint associates the concept of fatherhood with his own abusive father. So naturally, when he becomes an adult, that's the only form of parenting he knows, and he is himself a physically abusive parent. In the section of the book that gives the book its name, a person named W.K. Brown writes a story based on the experience he has with his first love, who has brunette hair. He writes the story and eventually makes small revisions to replace the hair color with that of his wife, who has red hair. And this tells us that the title of the book, in addition to referring to W.K.'s son, whose name is Rusty Brown, is also pointing us to this textual edit that takes place in the act of revision. But as W.K. tells us, after the story is accepted and printed, he continues to wonder if she will see it, the person who initially inspired the book. and the question continues to irk him at odd times, even over 20 or 30 years later. He can't quite disconnect the experience from that word, and the word will always follow him because the book that he published will always be a source of pride for him. So Toril Moi reminds us that nothing is more human than the denial of the human. And try as we might to find abstract readings beyond human life, it's only those experiences from which we're gaining insight when we talk about comics. The great thing about the Comics Forum is that it provides the opportunity to share the experiences that are that foundation of language. A comic book can show us the Potawatomi tribe to prevent them and their memory from evaporating into history. And ordinary language philosophy emphasizes a reading practice where we look to those words and we look to those life experiences that are buried in them. The last thing I want to mention is a quote from my professor when we talk about the evolution of the ordinary. My professor Theo Davis said that power attempts to render language useless, to disconnect it from reality. But now more than ever, we need language to be connected to reality. And that brought me to this quick George Orwell reference where he asked this question of, don't you see the aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. We need our words to be directly connected to the experiences that we intend for them to refer to. Otherwise, our words become useless and we lose the power that is embedded in them. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to discussing it some more.
All right, thank you so much. Well, why don't we go ahead and just all, if you're comfortable with it, I think we could go ahead and all have our screens on to start taking some questions from the audience. I'm gonna open up the Q&A box and see what starts coming in here. I'll help moderate these. I had a question to start off with for Brianna, if you don't mind. I'm really interested in these sort of romantic depictions of children as being so innocent and like incapable of dealing with certain things. And I'm really interested in your description of this like gentle fantasy and this cutification of marine animals in this case. You say that this underestimates children's ability to grapple with frightening environmental issues. And then in the sort of longer presentation that you give, which I would encourage everyone to watch, by the way, all of these longer presentations are really fantastic up on the Icaf site. You talk a little bit about the limits of the Paratext too, in terms of like how it sort of lays out some of these problems with coral reefs particularly, but there's a section that's like, you know, how do we stop this damage, where it's kind of like starts to fall apart and get a little vague, right? So I know that this is part of a larger project in your dissertation. I'm sort of wondering, is this a pattern that you see in children's and YA comics that are dealing with things like this? Do you see the same level of gentle fantasy and cutification and these sort of limitations in terms of fomenting action?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brittany. Thank you. First of all, yes. So this is, as you mentioned, part of my larger dissertation. And as I have been looking more and more into this, I have noticed that there is indeed this very troubling trend, right, where we really want to teach kids about the environment. And we know kids are interested about the environment because we see these young environmental activists, right? Greta Thunberg, they're out there, they're protesting. But the level of agency that we see actual children showing and the level of comprehension that these children show as they're talking about, you know, problems of capitalism, right? They understand what's happening, right? They know we're like almost out of time. And then we get our children's literature, which does not reflect that level of intellectual capability, that level of empowerment at all, right? So what we see in comics like Aquacorn Cove is sometimes this sort of gesture to larger systemic problems, right? So Aquacorn Cove kind of touches on the fact that the humans living in the village, they do need to survive. We can't just stop fishing, right? We need to be in harmony with nature, right? But what these texts often do is that they will gesture at these problems without actually fully exposing them, right? So in Aquacorn Cove, it gestures at the problem of overfishing and plastic pollution, but it disguises it under this under this fantasy facade, right? So we don't actually see like real dolphins tangled in nets or anything like that, because that would be too horrifying for children. We just see the lightly bruised baby aquacorn. So yeah, it just very much disguises it. And then what we often see in the paratext is that even if the narrative itself gestures at these problems, what we usually get in the paratext is this kind of cliche recitation of what children can do to help the environment, which is usually things like recycle, bring your reusable bags, right? It's never anything that would solve any sort of problem or that would acknowledge the fact that children can protest, that children can write lawmakers, that children can like boycott companies, right? So just the sort of disconnect between the literature we feed them and what children are actually capable of is very interesting to me. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
No, it's great. It does seem to be this tension of sort of acknowledging the concern or the understanding of it, but kind of shying away from like actually wanting to engage in a meaningful way. It strikes me that it would be interesting. We talk so much about like readership and like people's experience of texts. And it strikes me that this would be really interesting to get reader feedback from children and young adults about like what their takeaways are, and if this feels, you know, pedantic in some ways. I don't know. Thank you. I see a question in the chat here for Keith Friedlander. This person asks, have you looked into comics representation of drawing comics in workshops?
So representation of drawing comics in workshops is in like how drawing is taught or how it is done in like more commercial communal spaces? I think either way, the answer would be no, because I haven't really looked beyond kind of self-run kind of creator-led studio spaces. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to compare this environment to some of the other collaborative environments or some of the other learning spaces that that comic artists gather in, or that serve as like social spaces for them to create in. The only kind of comparative work that I've done at all is thinking a little bit about how these studio spaces serve as alternatives for educating artists, that there are a lot of young comic artists coming to these spaces for things like internships or mentorships, and that some of them are coming straight out of art school, or some of them are going to these studios as an alternative of having to pay for art school. But that's really the only basis of comparison for another social setting or workspace that I've done.
I have a question, Keith, too, that you might have answered in earlier a little. You might have gestured towards it a little bit. I thought it was so interesting that you were talking about, particularly in the larger presentation, about how, rising rents, particularly in like urban centers, are really making it more difficult to sort of create or maintain these kinds of communal spaces. And there's more, there's more sort of advice for folks to start like, living cheap and like, living in rural areas and things like that. And so like, as we're having this conversation like on Zoom, I mean, it's just, there's this way in which everything, like work and social life and everything else has been sort of switched on. So I know you're feeling that like Zoom teaching fatigue, and maybe you haven't gotten this far, but do you have plans to explore like the kind of, potential pop-up virtual spaces that are maybe fostering these same kinds of, I don't know, networking and support opportunities?
Yeah, that is actually, I haven't had the opportunity yet, but that is kind of like the next step that I'm considering, is that, some of the older artists that I spoke to said that that is the advice that they're now giving, is for people to seek those virtual spaces. And some of them made reference to, these virtual spaces are out there and there are these communities supporting them. I'm kicking myself for not looking up this artist's name before, because I'll never recall it. But one of the artists who had done his mentorship at Helioscope, followed that up by moving to Alaska as soon as he was done there and working from Alaska. And so he is one of the subjects that I would like to interview next, because he spoke very fondly of his time at Helioscope. I listened to an interview podcast with him on off panel, and he talked about how much he learned at Helioscope, but also that it was like an important transition for him to make, to move away from the urban center. So that is certainly an avenue that I want to investigate, and probably, especially in the time of COVID, is one of the more accessible things, one of the more accessible subject areas to research. So that is an area for growth.
Yeah, really interesting timing with that sort of research stuff too. I have a question for Ben that has come in through the chat here. Thanks for talking about linguistics. Always fun. Can you say more about ordinary language, right? So the characters in Rusty Brown and their use of language, do they experience revisions to their lives to the same extent as the text itself is revised?
I would say that anyone familiar with the works of Chris Ware might be familiar with this idea that unfortunately very few of his characters have what we would refer to as sort of happy endings, or sort of redemptive solutions to their stories as far as the narrative goes. Chris Ware seems to be someone who feels that we have very much to gain and learn from watching others' failures, and that tends to be the content of his narratives for the most part. I wouldn't call Rusty Brown very much of a fun read, but it's definitely an examination of the pitfalls of language, or maybe the efforts that people will go to detach life experiences from themselves, to try to ignore their past, and maybe not allow those life experiences to creep into their everyday language. And I think it comes across as a bit of a sort of cautionary tale to not resist one's history, to not attempt to detach one's language from life experiences, because they are very much irrevocable parts of ourselves. And I guess regarding ordinary language specifically, I think that what the text is sort of gesturing also is that we should try to use language that is as concrete and transparent as possible, because that's the easiest way to get to know other people's experiences, is by speaking up front and without abstraction. Sometimes the comics form is very much dependent on abstraction, because of course it's a half imagistic medium, but that text is there for a reason. And I think Chris Ware is sort of trying to tell us to try something new with language, maybe in this project. I hope I answered what that question was getting at.
I see that Martha Newbigging in the chat here is also thanking the panelists for such great presentations. And then she asks, Ben, have you published this research anywhere? Saying that she would like to read some more.
That's an honor. Thank you so much for the question. I'm a very new scholar of comics, we could say. I'm still just in the student phase of my PhD work, and I haven't done any formal journal publication yet. I published a comic book recently, which was just more of a personal project, but I haven't published this. But I think this has given me the inspiration to maybe try to submit it somewhere. So thank you for that comment. And I have questions for the fellow panelists, if we have an opportunity for that, Brittany.
No, please do.
So I had a question for Keith, which was using your sort of imagination in this moment, because obviously you haven't yet had an opportunity to do the formal research you'd like to on this COVID moment. Do you feel like there's been an opportunity created for virtual collaboration that maybe didn't exist before, or maybe wasn't as widespread? Obviously, there are just so many challenges that come with this situation, but do you see an opportunity for people outside of the traditional workspaces to be collaborating now more than before?
I mean, I see that almost as more of a risk than an opportunity at this point, because the fact is, virtual workspaces and virtual collaboration has been the growing trend for the comics industry because of the increased, potential for telecommunications over the last few decades. That, even if you go back, to the Silver Age of Marvel or something like that, you never had a bullpen where artists were actually, creating comics, shoulder to shoulder and having a shared workspace. You had a lot of people working from home and coming into the office and dropping it off on people's desks. So there's been a lot of remote working historically in the comic industry. And I think that what we've seen is as virtual work and communication has become easier, that you've seen kind of geographical dispersal of artists, that, yeah, you don't have to even live in the same city as the person that you write with or the same country as you write with. And that's been true for like 20, 30 years, because before, Zoom, they were just calling each other and faxing papers to each other and things like that. So I think that's been a growing trend, and I think that it will increase. And I think that there is more potential for that to work and become more convenient for people. But I think the flip side of that is part of the reason that comic creation can be a very exploitive field is because there is a lack of organization, that there is no unionization. And that's because there is a lack of spaces for people to gather and a lack of, so I do think that there's like a lot of potential there, and people will continue to explore it, and it will probably make a lot of artists' lives easier, the ease with which they can communicate and collaborate with one another. But I do think that that has a danger, because as rent costs go up in urban centers, and as people realize, oh, we just Zoom together, whatever, spaces like Helioscope and Raid and places where people can get together and organize will probably become harder to create, I would say. I don't imagine they'll disappear entirely, because I wouldn't want to underestimate Raid and Helioscope and their longevity, but I think it'll be harder to create and maintain those spaces.
Okay, I'm seeing another question for Ben Macklin. So is Ware's use of symbols, for instance, like he likes to name characters with colors, something that falls within ordinary language, or is it not a way of adding complex sediments?
Well, one thing is, I would definitely not assume that Chris Ware had the phrase ordinary language philosophy in mind when writing this book, especially because this book actually compiles works that he had been publishing in different formats for over 20 years. Not that ordinary language philosophy hadn't existed before then, but it seems like it's sort of a collection of many different attitudes. I would certainly say that there's a lot of complex sentiments or sediments involved within ordinary language, but I think one of the messages, at least among many, that Ware is layering here is to look at concrete language, in addition to the many layered themes that we might be familiar with in comics. But also, I think that I'm not necessarily sure that that simple words like colors necessarily gesture towards anything related to ordinary language philosophy, because the philosophy isn't about a certain kind of vocabulary. It's more about an attitude towards language, which is, let's try to communicate as clearly to each other as possible. And that definitely seems to be a theme of the book that I think is sort of separate from the themes that Ware is getting at with these the use of colors.
Right. And Keith, did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to ask Brianna a question. I was wondering if you could just, this is kind of a general question, but if you could just speak a little bit to, I thought that your reading of the comic was very insightful and very well articulated. I was just wondering if you could speak a little to how does that fit into the broader context of your research or your research interests? Are you examining, like, I think the rise of acute aesthetic is something that we've really seen in a lot of comic spaces in the last 10 years. Are you studying that aesthetic on a broader level, or is your focus more on just the representation of environmental issues?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I guess my interest, and I'm still in the beginning phases of working on my dissertation, but my interest in these environmental comics are kind of twofold. So on the one hand, I'm really interested in thinking about how these texts either facilitate or perhaps unintentionally hinder children's eco-activism. So to what extent do you read a book like Aquacorn Cove, and does it invite the implied child reader to participate in meaningful environmental action, or does it foreclose any sort of eco-activism because it's about aquacorns? It's not real, right? There's no aquacorns in danger. So that is one of the central questions I've been looking at. And related to that, I'm currently working on a chapter that looks at not just comics made for children, but comics made by children. So I'm looking at a lot of kids' environmental zines where they're creating their own comics about climate change, right? And the messages in the zines made by the children are often very different than the comics made by the adults, which is interesting. And then related to that, in a way, I'm also very interested in thinking about how the comics form itself in these comics is helping to capture these very abstract, frightening, large-scale problems in a way that is even understandable for children in the first place. So how do we take problems like climate change, right? Which you can't see climate change, right? You can only see symptoms of climate change. You can only point to it, right? We don't know how long climate change will last. We don't know what it's fully going to look like, right? So how do you take something that abstract and like depict it in a illustration with some text for children? So that's really the second strain of what I'm interested in, thinking about how things like panels and things like that can kind of provide like a glimpse of these vast problems. But because the comic itself is so fractured and artificial, you understand that you're only seeing a representation. So those are the kind of questions I'm really interested in. I hope that makes sense.
All right, Ben, did you want to ask another question as well?
Yeah, and I also had a question for Brianna, which is, I'm not very familiar with children's literature and children's comics, but what kinds of actionable interventions have you seen, if at all, in children's comics that are sort of prescribed to children as ways to contribute?
Yeah, great question. So I'm actually teaching a class on environmental children's literature this semester. So we're looking like very intensely at Paratext and like these narratives. And for the most part, I would say most of what we see in children's literature is very apolitical, right? It's very focused on individual small scale actions that children can do in the space of their home. So again, things like recycling, turning off the water when you brush your teeth. Maybe we sometimes get something like write to your local representatives or have a plastic drive at school, right? But they're very small scale, very limited actions, right? They very much limit children's agency to the domestic sphere. And then there is another strain of more radical environmental children's literature, but there's definitely less of it. And in those cases, they tend to try to very explicitly educate children about these systemic problems. And in many cases, they try to draw attention to the fact that there is no easy solution to these problems, right? So instead of saying, oh, if you just recycle, you can help the ocean, they draw attention to the fact that like there is millions of pieces of nanoplastics in the ocean, right? And we can never clean it up, which is more depressing, right? But also more realistic. So I think that, I don't know, it seems like environmental children's literature is very fixated on, okay, we have the story and now we're at the paratext and now we have to give you 10 steps that you can use, that you can do as a child. But I think that the most effective environmental children's literature actually doesn't give those easy solutions at all, because there are no easy solutions to climate change. And they just try to draw attention right to that vast scale. So that's what I've been noticing so far.
And I'm curious too, if you've done any, have you done any comparisons with similar like comics that are geared towards adult readers versus like, have you noticed any differences between the sorts of approaches in comics that are not directed towards children over the same topic?
Yes, for sure. So like one good, very adult comic is Climate Changed, which is this enormous tome, and it has all these facts and statistics about it, and it has like talking heads of scientists, right? And that very much does not shy away from like the dark realities of climate change and environmental issues, whereas most environmental children's literature is clearly trying very hard to educate children. Like, I think all these books are well-intentioned, but they perhaps shy away from the reality, perhaps because they think it's too depressing for children, or that you won't want to help because there's no point. But there's definitely a very noticeable shift in tone, I would say, between those two audiences.
Okay, thank you. I see one more question here in the chat from Maite Rukaregi, who says, thank you all for these wonderful presentations. I'm wondering if the presenters could speak to how their graphic activism engaging the panel theme. How do the texts or collectives that they investigate offer models for scholarship or activism, and how does the graphic fit into that?
Keith, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, yeah, I'll just, I guess, I don't know if the graphic necessarily fits into mine, but I think that in terms of activism, it's interesting when you, I think clearly the connection there is just kind of like labor conditions and the ability for labor organization to take place. And I do think that some of the people that I interviewed are actually very conscious of that. I think especially at Helioscope, there was a lot of conversation about how they treated their interns. And there was a lot of concern about whether or not they're passing on a willingness to the young artists who come into their studio to accept poor working conditions, and that they actually changed their entire internship program so that instead of giving their interns busy work, they were describing them as mentors and they were helping them publish their own work. So they were kind of conscious about how they were passing on that knowledge. But I think that there is also kind of limitations to that, because when you talk to them about things like, you know, do you work more than 40 hours a week, or how do you deal with crunch, or how do you deal with, you know, a lack of, you know, benefits or a safety net? A lot of it is just kind of like, well, you know, that's comics, you know, you got to work 60 hours a week to make deadlines. And they do talk about it. Some of them talk about it in a more self-conscious way than others. But I think there is also this attitude in even some veteran comic creators that it's like, no, you have to kind of work yourself to the bone to make it in the industry. And I think Steve Lieber, who's one of like the, you know, non-official head of Helioscope, was one of the few that I talked to who's like, no, I really understand now that I was working too hard and I've pulled it back and I'm trying to teach people to do that. But I think there is also this sense that the comic artists don't necessarily have the time to think about your activism. They're too busy trying to make their deadlines to worry about that.
I also, I suppose, have a quick answer to that question as far as my research goes, which is that I think the graphic side of the phrase graphic novel really offers a form of activism because it can show us the experiences that we are missing if language isn't really communicated effectively, or if life experiences aren't communicated effectively. For example, many people in America might not be familiar with the history of the Iranian Revolution. And as they say, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But thankfully, Marjan Satrapi created a book called Persepolis, which allows us to access that life experience from the perspective of a child. And I think just the presence of those images is a way of resisting the challenge that abstract language can create for us. I think it's very much in the graphics that the comics sort of provide their own intervention to that problem I was describing.
Yeah, so I think that the graphic novel that I'm looking at, Aquacorn Cove, obviously is trying to be very explicitly activist, right? It has an explicit call to action. At the end, you're supposed to want to be a guardian of the sea, as the graphic novel invites you to do. It gives you explicit ways to be an eco-activist, even if some of those are very limited and small scale, as I've talked about. But I also think that when we think about large scale problems like climate change, I do think that graphic novels can be very helpful for encouraging us to think about these issues, because things like statistics, right, are very abstract, and we can hear statistics and you feel guilty about them, perhaps, right? Statistics about how much plastic's in the ocean, right? But it's very hard to comprehend. So I do think that graphic novels do have an opportunity to help visualize some of these problems and capture them in a way that is very easy for all audiences to understand, right? Put it in a comic book and it's, you know, more accessible in a lot of ways, which is important. So.
Right, so now that we're down to just a couple minutes left here, I just want to see if there's any final questions from the audience before we wrap up. Also, I know, you know, to some extent, Keith and Brianna, we sort of have a sense of where you're going with these research pieces. Ben, is this connected to a larger project? Is this, I'm curious if this ordinary language philosophy is, you know, if you plan to apply this sort of reading to other texts of Chris Ware or other comics in general?
Maybe disappointingly for some, not at all. My research is, I'm mainly interested in comic strips, and I'm really excited to continue working on Calvin and Hobbes and analyzing that text really closely. I love children's literature, I love children's comics, and that's sort of the area where I'm trying to chisel my own little area in the scholarship. But the works of Chris Ware have been excellent sort of like transition into the world of academic scholarship of comics. There's so much literature on it, and he's producing work that's so complicated and interesting. I think now at this point I'm sort of moving on to a different project, although I'm so grateful for this opportunity to sort of revisit that project from last year.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm not seeing any final questions, so I might go ahead and just thank you so much for these really excellent presentations and for, you know, taking all of these questions and engaging in conversation. We really appreciate it. It's, you know, it's been, I know that for a lot of us, it's been difficult to make these transitions to all these online things. And on behalf of Icaf, you know, we're really looking forward to SPX and these different things, but it's so great to see these kinds of conversations continue to take place and see the research that's being done. And so thank you so much for participating in this roundtable in this format. We really appreciate it. Frank, did you want to make any final comments on behalf of Icaf before we close it out?
Yes, Brittany, thank you very much. I'm pleased to announce that our series has been really super successful. We've been very happy about it. Next month, Thursday, April 1st, will be our final panel roundtable in the virtual series. So please spread the word. We'll be making announcements about that shortly. Biz will be sending out some information to everybody about that. So we're sad to see it come to an end, but we're going to have a great panel to end the series. Thank you very much.